right, guys, welcome back. We're going to do our second section of grammar for chapter 6. It's the one that you're currently working in. For this week, we're going to take a look at indirect object pronouns. So we're going to go ahead and title our notes. Hopefully you have your notebook out and a pen or a pencil. Take notes just like you would if we were in class. And you're going to end up using these notes to help you as you do your activities. So let's go ahead and title this indirect object pronouns. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to start as a quick review. Last week we talked about direct object pronouns. So I just want to refresh our memory on 3 terms and make sure that we know what those 3 things mean. So we're going to look at subject, direct object, indirect object. Okay. So when we talked about direct objects last week, we talked about subject and direct object. So just as a reminder, and remember, if I go too fast, you can always pause, rewind, and then come back in when you're ready. Okay? So it's who or what is doing the action. Okay, that's really important because in Spanish, we are always going to conjugate the verb for the subject, meaning who or what's doing the action is who we conjugate for. So if I am talking, I'm going to say yo hablo. If I am eating, yo como. If they are eating, ellos comen. So we always conjugate for whoever's doing the action. So that's important to know. All right. Now, direct object is going to be who or what is directly, we can add that in, directly receiving the action. Okay. So we'll highlight this pink. Okay. So this is important too because it's not who we're going to conjugate for, but they're still important in the sentence. All right. Okay. So when we're looking at direct object, it's who or what is directly receiving the action. So I think last week I gave you the example of my grandma is baking cookies. So if we look at that sentence, my grandma is doing the action of baking. Okay. So who or what's doing the action? My grandma. That's the subject. What's directly receiving the action of being baked in the oven? What's the cookies? So that is your direct object. The cookies are receiving the action of being baked. Now what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the indirect object. Okay? This is going to be who or what the action is being done indirectly. We'll just keep that word in there. And we're specifically looking for this, to or for. Okay? So it's who or what the action is being done indirectly to or for. So I'm going to give you an example and we'll use some colors here to kind of highlight some stuff. Okay? All right. Now, let's take a look at that sentence, but we're going to add on. We're going to say, my grandma bakes cookies for us. She's so nice. All right, we want to be able to identify the different parts here, okay? So let's look for the subject first. So if we're looking for the subject, we're asking who or what is doing the action of baking. Okay, it's my grandma. So that right there is our subject. Okay, we'll just continue the highlight down. Okay, and remember that we're going to conjugate the verb for my grandma. All right, the next one that we're going to look for is the direct object. All right, so the direct object is who or what is directly receiving the action. Well, what's directly receiving the action of being baked in the oven? The cookies. So here we have our direct object. Okay. And the last thing that we're going to look for is our indirect object. We're seeing if for some reason my grandma is doing something to these cookies for somebody else. Okay. And what we find is, well, yeah, she's doing it for us. Okay. So this is going to be our indirect object. Indirectly, we get these cookies. She's not doing the action directly to us, but she's doing it indirectly for us. All right. So that was just a brief review of kind of the things that we talked about when we talked about direct objects. Now, the next word I want to make sure that we understand before we move on, okay, is going to be pronoun. Okay? And a pronoun is a word that replaces a noun. Oop, let me erase that. That replaces a noun. Okay? In both English and Spanish, we often use pronouns to avoid repetition. Repetition is just repeating ourselves over and over again. So for instance, if I were to say to you, hey, did you guys know I bought this book? I think the book is great. The book talks about this and the book talks about that. And the book is so many pages long and the book is written by da-da-da. At a certain point you say, okay, enough. I know you're talking about the book. At a certain point, I can replace book, right? I can replace it with it. Okay? So if we use these in English and Spanish just to help us avoid repetition. All right? Now, with indirect object pronouns, we're going to use them, okay, but we're going to use them a little bit differently than we did our direct object pronouns. And we're going to see where in the direct object pronouns where we replace book with it, for instance, in the indirect object pronouns, we're going to see where we're actually going to use them together with the indirect object. So we're going to double up on these, and you're going to see what that is. I just wanted to preview that for you. Okay, so what I really want to show you before we get started is that we've actually have already used indirect object pronouns. You just didn't realize that we were using them. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example of where we've used an indirect object pronoun before. So we used them with the verb gustar. So for instance, me gusta el libro. So we have me gusta el libro. So when we say this in English, we translate it as I like the book. But what we're really saying is, to me is pleasing the book. And it's almost backwards from what we do in English, okay? In English, we would turn this around and say the book is pleasing to me, Okay, but in Spanish, we're going to end up saying, to me is pleasing the book. So we're going backwards like this. Okay, the book is pleasing to me. So this right here is our indirect object pronoun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the chart on here so that you can see them. Okay, and then I'm going to explain how I put that together and how we end up putting it into a sentence and using all of it. So let me scroll up. Okay, and if you're following along, you can see this in the book as well. It's on page 202 in your book. But these are indirect object pronouns. Now, normally we would do this in a chart, right? So if I were doing my chart, I would draw a line here, here, and here, okay? And that puts us in the chart. You're going to notice that indirect object pronouns are going to look a lot like direct object pronouns. The only difference is going to be here in the bottom two boxes. For direct object pronouns, instead of le, it would be lo or la. And instead of les, it would be los or las. But they're going to look very similar, right? What I want you to do is take just a second, and I want you to pause the video, and I want you to make yourself this chart. And inside your chart, I want you to make sure that not only do you have the indirect object pronoun, but you also have the English translation. It's going to be to or for me, okay? To or for you informal. So take a second, pause the video. When you're done copying this down, go ahead and hit play again. Okay, welcome back. So let's go ahead and let's just practice saying them really quickly. So just repeat to yourself. You can just repeat after me, okay? Me, te, le, nos, os, if you're doing vosotros, les. Okay, so those are your indirect object pronouns. Remember, this is going to tell us who things are being done to or for. Okay, we're looking for those phrases: to me, to you, for him, etc. All right. Now, what we want to do is we want to figure out what the order is going to be on the sentences that we're going to use these with. We were simply using, before we would just say me gusta el libro or me gustan los libros, right? Now we're a little bit better at Spanish. We're going to put together some more complex sentences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an order of things to do in the sentence, because it's not going to match how we're going to do it in English or how we would translate it. All right, what I want you to do is I want you to write, okay, subject. Okay, that's our first thing. The second thing is going to be an indirect object pronoun. It's going to go second in the order. Then we're going to put a verb. And remember that we're going to conjugate that verb for whoever's doing the action. So that's our subject. Okay. Then what we're going to do is we're going to put a direct object. So we're going to practice using indirect and direct objects in the same sentence. Okay. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to put our indirect object. Now, I know before we said that a lot of times in English and in Spanish we use pronouns to replace nouns so that we don't have to repeat ourselves. But with indirect objects, you end up using both the indirect object and the indirect object pronoun in the sentence together. There is no English translation for this. This is strictly in Spanish. So don't try and make sense of it. We're just going to follow this formula. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a sentence in English, and then we're going to try and put it into this format. Okay? So we're going to say, and I'm going to skip some space because we're going to putting the Spanish right underneath. We're going to end up putting the Spanish all right here. Okay? So then I'm going to skip down just below that. Okay. So we want to say, okay, that Anna lends the skirt to Elena. Okay, that's what we're saying in English, right? This is our English translation. What we need to do is we need to identify these different parts and put them in the right order in Spanish. So let's look for our subject. Our subject's going to be who or what is doing the action. Okay? So, if I want to find who or what's doing the action, I just say the sentence back to myself. Anna lends the skirt. So who's doing the action of lending? It's Anna. So we're going to go ahead and put Anna here. Ana in Spanish, right? Okay. Then we're going to look for the indirect object because we're going to need to figure out the pronoun, okay? So we're going to look for, in the sentence, Anna lends the skirt to Elena, who is indirectly receiving the action of the skirt being lended. Who is it being done to, or who is it being done for? So we're looking for this, and we're looking for this. So we see that it's being done to or for Elena. Okay, great. Okay. And I'll go ahead and I'll highlight here so we can coordinate. All right. So my indirect object, we're going to use the personal a because that's a person, okay? Elena. So what we do is we look up in our chart to figure out which pronoun we're going to use for Elena. So Elena's a girl, so her. So if I want to say to her, then you can see in the chart, I look for, it's not me, it's not te, but it's le. So we go ahead and put le. Okay? So now we've got our subject, we've got our indirect object identified, and then also use the correct indirect object pronoun. It's being done to her. Okay? Now we need the verb. Okay, so we're looking, we'll go ahead and do orange on this one. So we're looking for the verb or the action, and remember that we need a conjugate for whoever's doing the action. So the action in this sentence is the action of to lend. Okay, now this is the verb prestar. Okay, so we need to conjugate. Okay, these are going to be connected because we need to conjugate the verb for the subject. So I take prestar and I put my stem, prest. It's an AR verb. So the ending I'm going to use for ella, for her, for she, is going to be an A, presta. Okay, so now we've got that. And the only thing left is our direct object. Okay. And remember that the direct object is who or what's receiving the action. So you look at the sentence, and even though it's the only thing left, we still want to make sense of this. We want to ask ourselves, who or what is receiving the action of being lent out? It's the skirt. Okay. So based on our vocab for this chapter, we know that the skirt is la falda. Okay? So we end up with Ana le presta la falda a Elena. Perfect. There is no rhyme or reason to this. You have to memorize the order that it's going to go in, okay? And then you have to remember the steps. So you're just going to practice this over and over again in the different activities that you're doing this week. And you're going to use these notes to help you. So feel free to have this video open so that you can review it as you're doing the activities, or have your notes out to help you as you're doing the activities. Okay? All right. Now, I want to remind you, okay, that if we know who it is, okay, so if we already know, and I'm going to take blue, and we're absolutely certain that we know who we're talking about in the indirect object, then you can leave that off. If I already know that I'm talking about Anna lending the skirt to Elena, I could just say, Ana le presta la falda. The le is going to say to her, and it's going to be assumed if there's no name that I already know who you're talking about. Okay? So that's just something to keep in mind. All right? Now, let's go ahead. Let's just take a look at one more quick note before we move on to some other things. Okay. So the next thing I want us to look at is what happens, though, if we have two verbs in a sentence. Because at this point in our Spanish career, we know that there can be two verbs in a sentence. So let's go ahead and let's just make another note, okay? When there are two verbs in the sentence, okay, you have two options of how, oops, sorry about that, to set up the sentence. Okay. So let me scroll up. All right, let's look at this, and I'm going to split a line down the center, and we're going to look at option number 1, and we'll look at option number 2. Okay? Now, let's take a look at option number 1. So we're going to write our note. Okay, make a nice little bullet point right there. All right. So option number 1 is we place the indirect object pronoun in front of the first verb. Okay, so if we look at that rule, I'm going to scroll up, and again, you can always pause if you need to finish writing, and then you can come back. But I'm going to scroll back up. If we're placing the indirect object pronoun in front of the first verb, it looks like we're following this rule. So if we're looking at our colors here, the stuff in green, right, it's our indirect object pronoun, and it's coming in front of that verb. The only difference now is that we're going to have two verbs in a row before we get to the rest of the sentence. Okay? So I'm going to show you what that looks like. So we'll come back here. Okay, so option number 1 says we place the indirect object pronoun in front of the first verb. So let me go ahead, and I'm going to give us an example in English, and then we're going to work our way through. Okay? So the example I'm going to give us is you, and we'll use you informal. Okay? So you want to pay the money, I'm just going to use a money symbol, okay, to him. Okay. So now we just need to look at our notes. So as I'm going through this, I want you to look up at your notes where you saw the order of things. And all we're doing is we're just adding in another verb. So I'm going to highlight, or I'm going to draw a box around. Our first verb is want. Our second verb is to pay. Okay? So we're just putting two verbs in a row. We're still going to put that indirect object pronoun in front of the verb. We're just doing it in front of the first verb. We don't want to split those two verbs up. So when we look at this, okay, according to our notes up above, we need to put our subject first. So we ask ourselves, who's doing the action of wanting to pay? Well, you are. So we're going to put to. Okay, so there's our subject. Now we need the indirect object pronoun. So the question is, who do you want to pay the money to? Well, it says right here, to him. So if we look back at our chart up above, so you're looking at your notes up above, if we want to say to him, we're going to put le. Okay? Then we're going to go ahead and put our verbs in. So instead of just having one verb, we have two. Now remember that we're conjugating want for you because you're the one doing the action of wanting. So it's the verb querer. It's an E to I stem changing verb. So we got quieres as our conjugation. Okay? You're doing the action of wanting to pay. If we're saying to pay, we're going to leave it in the infinitive. Pagar. Okay? Now, according to our order of things, all right, we're going to put in our direct object. Well, what is directly receiving the action of wanting to be paid? It's not him. Indirectly, he will receive this money, but it's the money that will directly receive the action of being paid. Okay? So we're going to put our direct object, which is el dinero, and we need to say to him as our indirect object at the end. So because it's a person, remember we're going to put a, and we just put el. Okay? Now it's really important, right? And we know this in class, that when we're doing things for él, ella, usted, or ellos, ellas, ustedes, we definitely need this. Because if we just had this right here, le could be to him, to her, or to you formal. So we need to really specify for that, okay? So we want to make sure we know it's to him and not to her or to you formal, okay? But that is the first option you have when there are two verbs. Okay, let's go to option 2. We'll go ahead and put a bullet point. So our note, if we want to try the other way to do this, okay? Not that we're going to place the indirect object, we're going to attach. So we're going to say we attach the indirect object pronoun okay, to the end of the second verb. And we do mean that quite literally. We are going to take the indirect object pronoun and attach it to the end so it becomes one word. It's almost like you're Velcroing it to the end of the back of that second verb. So we're going to use the same example. Okay. You want to pay the money to him. Sorry, that's a little close together, but just so I can fit the whole thing in. All right, and again, we've got two verbs. So now we're going to go with option 2. Everything else about the order is going to stay the same as we have in our notes up above. We're just going to move where we're putting that indirect object pronoun. Okay? So let's take a look at this. You are still doing the action, so we start with tu. But instead of putting le right after it, we're going to go directly to the first verb. So tú quieres, right? Because we're conjugating for you. You are wanting to pay, pagar. And this is where we attach it to the end. Okay? So if we want to say to him, we have to use le. We know that because we used it over here. So we literally just put it on the end and it becomes one word. Tú quieres pagarle. Then we can finish out the sentence. El dinero. Oh, let me erase that. Ooh, sorry about that. A él. Okay. And again, with le, we absolutely need to clarify who it is that we're talking about. So you've got two options there. We're going to look at one more example of this, and it's with using the verb estar to form the present progressive, which you guys did towards the beginning of when we were out of the classroom. So you might need to go back and look at your notes on the present progressive, okay? But let's go ahead. I'm going to give you an example. Okay. And we're going to keep it real similar to what we were just doing. Okay. So we were saying you want to pay the money to him. Okay, the present progressive is when actions are happening right now. Okay? So let's keep the same sentence, but we're just going to change up the fact that it's happening right now. So we're going to say you are paying him the money now. Okay? Meaning you're in the action of it. Okay, and we'll go ahead and we'll put it over here too. Now in English, remember that sometimes our translations are different than what we're actually saying in Spanish. So notice up above we said to him. Sometimes you have to look for that. You have to ask yourself, well, who is this money being paid to? Even though the word in English to isn't going to show up in the sentence, we have to think about the sentence and say, well, the money is going to a person, so that's my indirect object. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing. Remember that for the present progressive, we're using the verb estar and then an ando or yendo verb. Okay? So we're going to say to, because that's who's doing the action. There's our subject. Then what we do in this first one is we're putting the indirect object pronoun in front of that first verb, right? So that we go with le. And now what we're doing is we're using the verb estar, okay, conjugated for whoever's doing it. So if we're conjugating estar for tú, we get estás. Then we take the verb pagar, and because it's an AR verb, we add ando. Tú le estás pagando. Okay? And then we just finish it out. El dinero. And then we can put a él. And if we want, we can put the word ahora. Remember, we don't need that word. By using the present progressive, you're telling the reader that it's happening right now. Okay? So let's try our second option. We start off again with our subject, tú. We're not going to put the indirect object pronoun yet because we're going to attach it to the end of the second verb. Okay? So we're going to put tú estás pagando. And this is where we bring in the ley. We're going to just attach it to the end of that word. And actually, let me put it even closer so that you can see it's part of it. Okay, so we have pagando ley. Okay. El dinero a él. And again, we can put ahora. We don't need it. It's implied when you use this tense. Okay, now something that you need to know, okay, is that when you use this with the present progressive and we attach a pronoun to the end of what we call the present participle, okay, the ando verb, that's a present participle. When you put a pronoun, when we're using the present progressive on the end of the present participle, we're going to have to add in an accent mark. So what you're going to do, I'm using the color blue, is we're going to start at the end and we're going to count vowels back. We're going to go 3 back. So first one's right here, second vowel's right there, third vowel takes the accent. Okay, now that's a minor note, but in your activities, they might ask you for that. So you want to make sure that you've got that written down. So we just count backwards. 1, 2, third vowel takes the accent. Okay. All right. Now we've got some examples for you to use as you guys are doing the activities. Okay. Let's go ahead. We're going to look at the very last section for this. We're going to look at 2 verbs that you're going to use these indirect object pronouns with a lot. Okay. So let me go ahead and scroll up. Your book does it one way. That's fine. It's on page 203, but they put both verbs in the same conjugation chart, and I'm not a huge fan of that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to make my own charts and you can just follow me. Okay? So we're going to title this section 2 verbs that are often used with indirect object pronouns. Okay. So 2 verbs that are often used with indirect object pronouns. All right. The first one is going to be the verb, and I'm going to skip some space here, so I want you to do the same because we'll put a note up above, is the verb dar, which means to give. Okay. The second verb is going to be the verb decir, which means to say or to tell. Now, the reason these 2 are going to get used with indirect object pronouns a lot is because you often give something to someone, or you often tell something to someone, or say something to someone. So that's your indirect object pronoun. Okay, you're going to be talking to somebody, giving something to somebody. All right, now the note that I wanted us to put above, that's why we skipped a little space. Okay, the verb dar is irregular. Okay, that means that we're going to need to memorize it. Okay, the verb decir is also irregular, but we're going to add a little extra note. Okay, irregular in the yo form, and a wannabe E to I stem change in the other forms. Okay, So remember we talked about this in class, that if one form of the verb is irregular, it's an irregular verb. But we have verbs like tener, that's tengo, which is irregular in the yo form, but the rest of it really wants to be an e to ie stem changing verb. Tienes, tiene, and then remember nosotros, vosotros, we don't change. So we get tenemos, tenéis, right? Decir is going to do the same thing. So now let's go ahead and let's do our charts. If you are still needing to put in your subject pronouns to help you, nothing to be embarrassed about, but I want you to go ahead and do it. So then that way you have that there to help you. Sorry, these charts are not very even. Okay, and remember subject pronouns are yo, tú, él, ella, usted, nosotros. If you're learning vosotros, great. Ooh, helps if I spell it right. Okay. If you're not, don't worry about it. Ellos and ustedes. Okay. So same thing would be over in the chart for decir. If you still need to use those, use them. Okay. There's nothing to be ashamed about. They help you to organize your information. So since it's irregular, here we go. The verb dar, the stem is D. Your ending is AR. Okay. So it's going to go irregular in two parts, but let's go ahead and just put our stem in. Now, it's irregular in the yo form, so we get O, Y, doy. But the rest of it, you're going to put your AR endings. So as, a, amos, ice. This is where it's irregular. There's not going to be an accent on that A. And then on. So you can see that really our only irregularity is here and that there's no accent there. Okay? It's just a weird verb because the stem is only the letter D. Okay? Then we get to the verb decir. It's going to be irregular in the yo form. So we're going to go digo. But the rest of it is going to be like an E to I stem changing verb. So inside the boot, and let's go ahead, we'll highlight this one as irregular. And then what we'll do is we'll use green to highlight the boot, just to give us a visual and a reminder of what that looked like for stem changing verbs. Okay, color that in. Okay, perfect. That means outside of the boot, I'm still going to use this as my stem. But inside the boot, I'm going to do this as my new stem. I'm swapping the E for an I. It's an IR verb, right? So we need to add our IR endings. So tú will be es, él, ella, usted, e, nosotros, imos, vosotros, is, ellos, ellas, ustedes, en. Okay, so we get digo, dices, dice, decimos, decís, dicen. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm just going to show you some examples that are in the book so that you can see what these verbs look like and why they're so often used with indirect object pronouns. And we'll just kind of highlight this section. That's our section title, right? Okay, perfect. Okay. So one example that they give you in the book, okay, is talking about telling the truth. Okay? So let's go ahead and we'll do a different example from the book just so that you have multiple examples. Okay? To tell the truth is decir la verdad. Okay? Now, that's going to equal to tell the truth. Okay, so let's try the sentence, I'm telling the truth to her. We'll just use her. Okay. Now, if it's not happening right in the moment, we're not going to use the present progressive, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to use just the regular present tense. So this is going to count as one thing, one verb, okay? So we go back to our example, okay, where we had everything colored out as far as the order of things. We look for the subject. So who is it that is telling the truth? Who's doing the action? Well, I am. So let's go ahead and start with that. Yo. Who am I telling the truth to? Well, I'm going to be telling the truth to her. So, to her, or to him, or to you formal, is le. Now I need the verb, according to our sample, right? I need the verb decir, but conjugated for yo. So I look at my chart and I say, okay, yo le digo. All right. Now I need my direct object. What is it that's receiving the action of being told? Well, it's the truth. So we're going to put la verdad. Okay. And then who am I telling it to? We're just going to make sure we clarify. A ella. Okay. Now we're going to try one more. We're going to do the exact same sentence, except we're going to say that it's happening right now, just so we can see both ways of doing it. Okay? So we're going to say, so here was the first example. We're going to say, I'm telling her the truth. So now we're talking more like we normally would in English. I'm telling her the truth right now. Okay. So we've got two options. Option number one, we put our subject, yo. Then we need the indirect object of who we're going to be telling the truth to. Well, I'm going to be telling the truth to her. So in option number one, I can go ahead and put it in front of the two verbs, le. Then, if I want to say I am telling right now, we use the verb estar. So I conjugate it for yo, estoy. We have the verb decir, which in this case, we need to put an yendo ending on it, and we're going to keep that stem change. Diciendo. Yo le estoy diciendo. Then we just finish it out. La verdad a ella. Okay? And we put it right there. Just like we did up here. Put it in front of that first verb. In this first example, there's only one verb, so we didn't have to worry about it. In this one, option number one, we put it in front of the first verb. Now, option number two, we're going to put it as an attachment to the end of the second verb. So we're going to say yo. We're going to move it. So we're not putting le first. We're going to say estoy diciéndole. Okay? Then we just finish it out. La verdad a ella. Okay? We put it right there. Now, just as a reminder, when we do that attachment, we're going to get in the habit of putting accent marks. We're going to count 3 accents back. 1 right here, 2 right there, 3 takes the accent. Okay? So hopefully this was helpful. I want to remind you that you should keep these notes out while you're working. Don't try and do the activities without your notes. Okay, this is not a game to figure out if you can remember everything that I've just taught you. This is using your notes to actually function in Spanish and do a good job on those activities so that when we come back next year, it at least feels familiar and you will be able to have these notes to bring with you next year. Okay? All right, if you need anything, you can always come into my online help sessions or live class sessions. If you're not one of my students, make sure you ask your teacher for help, okay? Here's my email just in case. So cstraka@heartdistrict.org. All right, good luck on those activities. Let me know if you need any help.